Do you like my new earring? I was supposed to put it last week to celebrate Halloween, but I forgot. Now you get to see it.
Oh my God, you just made Nola! No! God, please, no!
Welcome back to Torn Apart. Today we're talking about something that I've been expecting for quite some time, but I couldn't really prepare a review for it last week because it literally came out a day before my usual release date. So you're getting it now.
Just eat it, eat it, eat it, eat it, eat it, eat it.
I love Guillermo del Toro's work. I think there is maybe just one film in his entire filmography that I don't like, which is Nightmare Alley. And I think I actually made like a review comparison with another Italian film a couple of months ago, which you can check out. I really love his work. I love his sensibilities when it comes to the fantasy genre. And of course, I love his new series. And fun enough, it's exactly what I wanted to see from Mike Flanagan's most recent series called Midnight Club. It was scary, it was gory, it was well written, with interesting characters, and at the end of the day it was also consistently really well made.
Curiosity is the most beautiful thing in fantasy. If you can acquire the state of a child with white eyes, then you're being healed.
Despite the fact that Guillermo del Toro put together a team of directors who are really different from each other, whether it comes to how they engage with the horror genre. And I think I have to start this video by saying that I think that Cabinet of Curiosities is a huge success. It has very highs and it hits a couple of meh kind of episodes, but it's never bad because the production design is incredible, the budget is there to support it as well, and I'm honestly surprised that Netflix is producing this.
Cabinet of Curiosities is a show that I've always wanted to make. In this anthology, we gave ownership of each episode to the directors.
I think one main difference in between this series here and other anthology series like American Horror Stories or even other films like the VHS franchise, of which I talked about last week, or even ABCs of Death or any kind of anthology property, is that it is very consistent from a thematical point of view but also from a visual point of view. One thing that I like about all of these episodes here, first of all, is that they treat the creatures and the monsters in very classic Guillermo del Toro way, meaning that very often they're not really the villains of the story, it's just human beings who are greedy and who go meddling with things that they just should leave alone. And I like that kind of aspect because very often we tend to have monsters be the villains and people slash human beings having to rise up to fight them and to vanquish some sort of evil at the end of the day, which is actually a very cliche way of structuring horror movies when you think about it. So I do like that Guillermo del Toro really managed to bring this idea in most of the episodes.
With Cabinet of Curiosities, what I'm trying to say is, look, the world is beautiful and horrible at exactly the same time.
The thing that I really loved, for example, and we can contrast it once again with Midnight Club, is the almost complete absence of jump scares. There is a lot of tensions, there are a lot of episodes which I found incredibly creepy and memorable, but there are almost no jump scares, and I like that because I feel like it really challenges all the different directors to create a sense of tension in different ways which go beyond the loud noises and sound effects.
Loud noises!
In this review, of course, I will be analyzing every single episode from the very beginning to the very last minute itself, and I will give you a little bit of a ranking as well when it comes to my favorite episodes. We start with episode 1, which is called Law 36, which is directed by Guillermo Navarro. Maybe that name doesn't really ring a bell, but it's mostly because he's directed a lot of TV shows, episodes, shows like Narcos, Preacher, but one title actually attracted my attention, and it's the series Hannibal. He directed 6 episodes from that series, and of course that tells a lot because Hannibal was such a beautiful looking series, incredibly well directed. There isn't a single episode in that series that feels like filler, so it was such a good choice for a first episode. And I actually think that the very first and and the very last episodes are the best stories that Guillermo del Toro is trying to tell with this series. And of course it makes sense because you want to have a strong opener and you want to have a very memorable finale as well. But they are pretty good in very different ways. And this is what is really exciting about this series. When it comes to Lot 36, of course an excellent performances by Tim Blake. I really loved the very dark undertones, and I really love the fact that it takes place in the suburbs of a very small town. It feels very industrial, it feels very, well, kind of greedy, you know? I feel like the kind of the look of the places where they decided to shoot this episode really matches with the characters themselves. It feels like they've corrupted the city or the city has corrupted them, but they're both kind of like slowly falling apart, and I really like that. One thing that I loved about almost every single episode is that they really have texture. And when I talk about texture, you really have to pay attention to the production design and to the locations that they've used. Look at the ceilings, look at the walls, look at the furniture that they use. There is such an amount of detail, and it's incredibly exciting because of that, because everything feels very real and it feels like you can touch it with your hands, and it feels like it's also telling so many different stories that we just get a glimpse on, and they make all the universes feel so much more realistic and so much more relatable at the end of the day. Another thing that they do for most of the episodes, but they do it really well for Lot 36, it's good writing when it comes to even the secondary characters. I really understand who these people are, I understand what struggles they're going through, and I understand who they are very deeply, despite the fact that maybe they have only a couple of scenes or dialogue lines. I think it works quite well. Incredible special effects and practical effects, of course, but this is the same when it comes to all the different episodes. If I'm not mistaken, there isn't a single thing that I found weird when it comes to the look of this series, and that's saying a lot when it comes to Netflix content, because very often you will find something, you will find a specific effect that just doesn't look right. But it was not the case with the series, and it's weird. Of course, I don't want to spoil the stories themselves, so every single time that I will be reviewing the episodes, I won't be giving you the plot breakdown, because I think you should experience it by yourself, and I'm just giving you a couple of guidelines so you can pay attention to the stuff that is actually really good. To be honest, this very first episode here is already one of my favorites, mostly because it's a perfect example of how you set up a scene and how you set up a horror story that doesn't really feel like we already seen before, but at the same time it doesn't really feel like a short film. It feels like the story is being exploited to its optimal potential, and it doesn't feel like anything else is being left out on the editing table. We're seeing the story in its most perfect form, and that's exactly why I think this series at the end of the day was so successful, because every single episode felt like a really good story first and foremost, and it didn't really feel like just a weird concept that Guillermo del Toro wanted to explore for like 30 minutes or so. The second episode is called Graveyard Rats, and it's directed by Vincenzo Natali.
Please, show me mercy.
Who you might know as the director of Cube, or even the incredibly weird movie Splice starring Adrian Brody. A movie that I still remember to this day as a really weird movie, even though it was not necessarily good, but it was definitely really effective as a horror film. The main character is played by David Hewlett, who is one of my favorite actors from the Stargate SG-1 and Atlantis casting.
Diameter of a Stargate is not arbitrary. There is a specific correlation between the energy required to create a stable wormhole
and the size of the gate. I know that.
And it's exponentially proportional to size, which means the energy required to create a connection with a supergate would far exceed that of an ordinary gate. I am just saying the yield calculations can be extremely tricky, if not borderline impossible. You may need me.
Colonel Carter said as much. Ooh, we weren't going to tell him that.
And I think he pushes it really far in this gothic tale here. The story, of course, is once again about a greedy character who goes around cemeteries to basically go grave digging so that he can find golden teeth, for example. Once again, about punishing these kind of awful people. When I saw it for the first time, I was like, I hope that not every single episode is gonna be starring really ugly kind of characters that we're just rooting for them to die and for them to not succeed at what they're trying to do. do. But of course, they proved me wrong with the third episodes and with all of the other ones. It does not only star bad characters so that we can appreciate when they actually get killed by creatures. I enjoyed this episode mostly because there are not that many horror films that take place underground when you think about it. It really gave me some The Descent vibe. So if you enjoy the claustrophobic kind of mood of The Descent, I think you'll enjoy this quite a lot.
The Graveyard Rats was a story I read when I was very young, and I got so scared that I called my father to open the door of my room.
One thing that I didn't really like is that this episode kind of hints at a lot of interesting ideas. There is a weird Lovecraftian statue that he finds at some point. There is a reanimated corpse, but there is also like a huge rat going around, kind of like a rat king. So many things that are like hinted at, and we have no idea why they're there or what the hell is going on at the end of the day. And there is no exploration of those creatures. There is no exploration of those themes specifically beyond the idea of just don't be greedy because it will lead you to really bad stuff. But at the end of the day, it was incredibly well paced and incredibly well made, so I still enjoyed it, but it's still not as perfect as the one that I was talking about before. This third episode is called The Autopsy and it's directed by David Pryor.
This is one of those nightmare specials.
Who is actually the director of the movie The Empty Man, which I still haven't seen, but I've heard really good things about it. Oh, by the way, I completely forgot to talk about the beginning, so the intro of every single episode, where we have Guillermo del Toro talking about horror conventions, talking about horror cliches, and talking about creatures, and presenting basically every single episode by himself. I really love that. It was a beautiful homage to Alfred Hitchcock, who used to do it as well.
Good evening. Do you believe in ghosts? Of course not. I knew you didn't.
And of course, it was always incredibly cool to see how Guillermo del Toro was so passionate about this project that he wanted to actually present the talent involved by himself and kind of give us a little bit of a hook so that we wouldn't get lost in this anthology series, because I feel like that's the kind of a problem that we have with anthology films specifically. It's that very often we don't seem to know where it's going. If you're someone who likes to binge watch things, I feel like when it comes to anthology horror movies, you kind of end up putting all of those stories together and it ends up being quite confusing. So I like the idea of Guillermo del Toro kind of like taking a step back and reintroducing you to a different universe every single time.
Hi, I am Guillermo del Toro and welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities of my own making. You're gonna find in this book, you get a glimpse into things that are really, really personal to me and how I create the stories that I create.
So to go back to episode 3, The Autopsy, this is probably one of my least favorite ones, not because of the production design once again, not because of the CGI, because everything is working quite well. I actually like the performances as well, and I actually like the concept. I think the concept is incredibly interesting, but I think it was not exploited to its optimal potential. For example, it would have been really interesting if the entire episode was just the autopsy, because basically what we're trying to do is trying to understand what happened in the mines, and we are with this physician here who is going through the different cadavers and he's learning what happened to them and by extension what happened in the mines themselves. And it would have been incredibly interesting if this was a weird murder mystery horror episode where we have no idea what happened, we just see the explosion for like a couple of seconds and we immediately go to the autopsy, and from there we start to put all the pieces together. But it kind of tries to do both at the same time. We have some flashbacks, we have other scenes introducing the idea of going to do an autopsy, and then we finally get the autopsy and we learn more things about what happened. But it's a bit of a shame, I think. The thing that I really didn't like, it's an episode that feels very self-explanatory in the way that the villain at the end of the episode just spends like maybe 10 minutes monologuing and saying the most cliche kind of villainous things I've ever heard. Those kind of things that you hear all the time, like oh, like we've infiltrated all the different governments and you have no idea how many people people we've killed and how many governments have fallen because of us. It feels very cheap because we don't get to see it. It's just someone who is kind of like spitting out empty words and we have no idea of the actual stakes of what he's talking about. So I didn't like that. I felt very cliche at the end of the day, even though it was really brutal and I love all the practical effects. Definitely not one of my favorites. Episode 4 is called The Outside and is directed by Lily Amirpour.
Step out of your skin and into your hollow glow.
Who you might know because she directed the incredibly good A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night or even The Bad Batch. And actually she released another film a couple of years ago which I've heard absolutely nothing about and that I really need to check out because I really love her style.
Why do you think you're in charge?
She's really good when it comes to creating horror satires. So of course I knew that this episode was going to be very different from all the others, which feel very gothic, feel very mysterious, and we're trying to understand things that we're not supposed to. This one here is more grounded, and I think at the end of the day it's really more feminist than gothic. For example, one way in which Amirpour managed to tell this story and that a guy would never have been able to do it was when we saw that the main character's passion was actually taxidermy. And actually I think that I've never seen a single woman in fiction, so in films and TV series, being passionate about taxidermy, which tends to be a very kind of like awful hobby that is dedicated to men. If you think about Jeffrey Dahmer, once again, the way that those directors decided to show the taxidermy was incredibly disturbing, in opposition with how Amirpour decided to show it here, which makes it feel like just a normal hobby. And it's incredibly refreshing, of course, because we don't really expect her to do that, and we also get a chance to see why she loves taxidermy so much. She's kind of obsessed with creating perfection, keeping the appearances going for everything around her, whether it is animals or whether it is her own body, because of course this episode is all about that. It's all about superficiality, and it's all about, unfortunately, succumbing to the patriarchal standards when it comes to women's beauty. I really love the way this episode is shot. It feels very different. I feel like they use some anamorphic lenses, especially when they're shooting the party scenes, because it really distorts the faces and it makes the main characters look even more ridiculous than they are in real life. I felt that was really refreshing because it was kind of enhancing the impression that we already got from them. But it's really fascinating because I feel like she really managed to talk about those kind of issues, and she really managed to create these characters who don't really exist beyond their relationship with men, beyond talking about men, beyond being perfect, for eventually ended up with a man. And if you just pay attention to all the conversations that they have, they always end up talking about people's dicks. They talk about divorces, separations, or about weird gossip about someone else's wife doing something weird to her husband or something like that. And of course all of that is completely done on purpose. It really has a weird kind of 60s vibes. It feels like one of those movies about forced domesticity, where being at home or being married has changed these women so much that they don't have an identity anymore, and they rely so much on perfection and they rely so much on their own looks to kind of have a sense of self-worth that it's become almost disgusting. That's the horror part of this episode here. It's everything that is going under the surface. It really feels like someone has literally like brainwashed these people to talk like what men expect women to talk about. And it's incredibly interesting. I'm pretty sure this is one of those episodes that like standard horror fans will not really enjoy because it's not as disturbing as the other ones. This has more interesting themes and a really subtle direction, and that's mostly why I liked it, but maybe not everyone will. And of course the final shot of this episode here is breathtaking. It's so incredibly creepy, and I love the fact that she's directly looking at the camera, kind of like guilt tripping us, the viewers themselves, because we have looked at her transforming herself into something that doesn't look like her anymore. We never tried to help her, we never tried to stop her, and it's kind of interesting. And I also like the fact of how they explore all the different dynamics in between men and women. For example, the main character's husband, he seems to be a very supportive guy guy. But at the end of the day, I found it interesting because there is a conversation about how he doesn't want her to change. But that's the problem as well. If you respect someone enough, then if they want to change, if they tell you that they really don't like the way that they look and they want to do something about it, then you should support them as well. But when he says that thing about how he doesn't want her to change, it's just because he wants her to fit a certain standard of looking because he's accustomed to it as well, and maybe he's even reassured by it. Episode 5 is called Pickman's Model, and it's directed by Keith Thomas.
The darkness has a way of catching me.
Do you feel it, Will? The fear. Who also directed the movies The Vigil and Firestarter. I've heard really bad things about Firestarter, but I've heard really good things about The Vigil. When it comes to horror movies, sometimes you get a good one, sometimes you get a bad one. It doesn't necessarily tell something about the director's capabilities. It really depends on the script, and it depends on the amount of budget that they have and what they want to achieve with it as well. When it comes to this episode, I really loved it. This is the most gothic of all of them, and I loved it because it's also very Lovecraftian. It's very cosmic horror. It has a sense of the supernatural as well, and it packs everything together so well. And this made me wonder also about painters, and painters specifically who used to paint like incredibly disturbing stuff. If you think about Soutine, for example, who spent most of his career painting carcasses, so incredibly huge animal carcasses. And it's interesting because this episode gives you that perspective of seeing what it would feel like to be an artist who's portraying those kind of obscenities for the time, and who sticks out way too much from what everyone else is doing when it comes to their art form. So I found that interesting, and of course we got a lot of gore, and I think they really shot all the painting kind of obscene scenes so well. I love the way that the camera kind of zooms in and changes all the different kind of perspectives and focuses on certain details, and you see sometimes the paintings kind of like being animated and moving by themselves. I feel like this was one of the most disturbing episodes without a doubt, and I really wanted this to end, but not in a bad way, in a good way. And I knew that it was not going to happen because of course it's an actual Lovecraft story, and we know that those stories never end well for anyone.
I don't know who's seeing this over here, but some of these drawings are pretty disgusting. The team putting together the art departments and the props department, set design and everything, all builds. Even the lighting in a scene can make you feel ill at ease. I really like the idea that Ben Barnes was the main character in this episode here. I love his performances in The Punisher, and he was okay in Shadow and Bone as well, but he has something really interesting about him. The way that he looks, he seems to be a very tortured kind of actor, and he really portrays that sentiment very well. And of course, the other painter I was talking about before is played by Crispin Glover, who probably everyone has kind of like seen that face somewhere else, but you couldn't really place it. He used to play the young version of Marty's dad in Back to the Future 2. So yeah, that's why you remember him.
Well, actually, I figured since it wasn't due till Monday.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hey, think McFly, think.
Episode 6 is called Dreams of the Witch House, and it's directed by Catherine Hardwicke.
You never should have come back.
Who you might know for directing the really good drama 13, or even the first Twilight movie. Yep, it's her.
You want to do that interview?
I don't want to talk.
Wednesday? Tuesday?
Dude. You slapped a fish. You punched it. Why would you hit it?
I wanted to make some seafood.
That's so loserly.
So of course people were kind of like maybe thinking about what is she going to do, because most of the other directors were clear, very horror-based directors, and Catherine Hardwicke is kind of like the only one who's done a mix of both. At the end of the day, I felt that the story felt a bit convoluted and going into a lot of different cliched kind of ways. I was not surprised at all by the ending or even by how the plot was advancing. It also reminded me of other kind of like Studio Ghibli movies in the way that that the fantasy kind of world is represented in very idyllic ways. It's not really like the scary upside down that we see in Insidious, for example. But there are some really creepy scenes. For example, there is a sleep paralysis kind of like nightmare sequence, which is really, really creepy. And it really reminded me of things that I've suffered through. So yeah, just saying that even the episodes that are not perfect, they're still interesting to look at for so many different reasons. And that has to do probably with Guillermo del Toro just inspiring these people and giving the freedom to do what they wanted. Episode 7 is The Viewing and it's directed by Pamos Cosmatos.
Mesmerizing.
Who you might know as the director from Mandy or Beyond the Black Rainbow. So there is one thing you need to know about Pamos Cosmatos is that he's an expert of mood, of creating tension, of creating a specific kind of atmosphere that you lose yourself within. If you remember Mandy, for example, that movie there didn't really have a strong story or even strong dialogues at the end of the day, but it was such a perfect mood and you just couldn't look away when anything was happening on screen. So this is the same when it comes to The Viewing. The Viewing doesn't really have a strong story at the end of the day. It just relies on a good, simple concept, and it's the one that looks the most like a short horror film and it doesn't really feel like it's telling a story from A to Z. And I feel like it's probably one of those episodes that people will not like as much, mostly because of all the reasons that I've talked about. But it's so beautiful, it's so well crafted. I really love all the reddish tones. There is a lot of noise, and if you look at all the different lens flares, they probably use specific lenses which kind of like give you those lens flares which elongate so much across the entire screen. And of course I kind of feel like the mystery really pays off in the end. There are some gruesome murders and I really love the creature design because it really looks like nothing that you were expecting. And it kind of reminded me of a weird like hell demon from the video game Doom. So this is kind of the episode where you just sit down and chill. If you want to smoke some weed, go ahead, because it's exactly that kind of mood where you just sit there being like, what the hell is going on? This is so weird, nothing feels right. It feels like we just entered a different dimension. This is what this episode is about. And if you go in with those expectations, you'll really enjoy it. Funny enough, this episode also had a lot of weird Kill Bill vibes. This is definitely the episode that has the most amount of kind of sci-fi exploitation, horror aspects to it.
Pamos Cosmatos has the capacity to create more than anything a vibe, and essentially you are transported into Panos' world.
The final episode is called The Murmuring and it's directed by Jennifer Kent.
I'm very worried about you.
Who is the incredibly talented director behind movies like The Babadook or even The Nightingale.
Hello?
I really love The Murmuring and I think it's one of the best episodes in the entire series, mostly because of the writing, mostly because it is starring characters who are just really lovely. Andrew Lincoln is really nice, and of course we have the same actress that we saw in The Babadook as well, who is once again amazing, and I really love how they work together as well. I really like when they feature couples who are actually trying to work out their issues by themselves instead of just breaking up, storming out, or like psychologically abuse each other. And this episode was really about that kind of stuff. It was about dealing with trauma, and at the end of the day, this is the best horror episode if you actually want to be scared. Jennifer Kent is really good at creating tension. There are so many moments where I was just holding my breath, not knowing what was going to happen. Even though the story is actually quite straightforward and it kind of stars those usual ghosts who have committed heinous crimes and then felt bad about it, and that's why they're so angry. Those are incredibly cliche horror things that we've seen over and over again, but Jennifer Kent kind of grounds it in so many interesting things. Just the idea that this couple moved this island here to go bird watching, it's really nice. It's a really nice touch. It's a hobby that works quite well and that is really well represented. And I think she really managed to encapsulate what it feels like to be a bird watcher and why these people love it so much. And they have so much appreciation for these birds. Probably the reason why I enjoyed this episode even more, it's just that it focuses on the sound so much, while all the other episodes really relied on visuals, strong cinematography, a very specific look, or incredibly creepy, weird looking creatures. This episode here just relies on sound and setting up a specific mood. It really reminded me of a movie called Barbarian Sound Studio, which I really recommend as well, and it just relies on sound once again to just keep that tension up and makes you really crap your pants.
Who's there? Who's there? I will call the police.
And this episode kind of proves how easy it is to create tension, but also to scare people with very, very minimal set design and minimal kind of effects as well. The creepiest moments are always the ones where we're looking through the shadow, trying to see if there is a ghost there or not, or ghosts hiding in the shadow and whispering things to you. There is a scene which is incredibly powerful, which reminded me of the scene from the Babadook as well, where you see kind of like the Babadook slowly moving towards you and there is no escape. So that worked incredibly well. And once again, here I see why it was so interesting to have a female director tell this story here, because we have another interesting theme when it comes to addressing how men and women deal with traumas, but also how men refuse to listen to women and kind of like they only see one specific way of trying to help them, and they are unable to just see that there are different ways of helping people. And it's not that just because someone is refusing what you're telling them, it means they don't need help or they're not asking for help. It's just that you have to listen more, pay more attention. One sentence that I really liked when it comes to this episode here, and it was repeated a couple of times, it was, people see what they want to see, and it's of course delivered by a man to the main character's wife. And it's really interesting to see that men very often are the ones within the ghost possession genres which never see the ghosts themselves and end up gaslighting the main female characters. And I also love the fact that all the different conversations that the couple have, they kind of showcase all the different problems that can arise from communication. A good example would have been Andrew Lincoln's character, who kept trying to have sex with his wife despite the fact that it's literally not what she needed. She wanted to do the bird watching, she wanted to focus on her work, because sex for her would lead her to think about the death of her child, and for her it was a traumatizing thing to go through, so she didn't want to go through it. But for Andrew Lincoln, for example, for him, from his perspective, sex was the only way to actually connect with her, because from his perspective his wife was not properly communicating all the trauma and the sadness that she felt when their daughter died. So this was the only way that he was trying to communicate with her. And I love that, of course, through the writing and the dialogues and the performances, we got to explore all of these real things while also being incredibly scared. Anyways, this is a huge recommendation for me. I really love this series. I loved it almost as much as Haunting of Hill House. It's definitely Haunting of Hill House, then I will put this one here, so Cabinet of Curiosities, then I would put Midnight Mass, and then I would put Bly Manor, and at the very bottom I will put Midnight Club. Even though, I mean, Guillermo del Toro and Mike Flanagan, they have nothing to do with each other, despite the fact that I found a really interesting interview with both of them. So they seem to be aware of each other and respect each other's work quite a lot.
And I started to think the reason I love horror is because as a kid who was scared...
You were scared.
Yeah. I learned how to be braver. I had these little bursts of exercise in courage. And it started to make me look at the world a little different. Because if I could carry myself through whatever courage I had to summon to make it to the end of it, you know, to make it to the end of a particularly scary movie, if I could carry just a fraction of that out into real life, then this genre has actually helped me grow.
Fear's like It's like radiation. You spend enough time around enough of it and it changes you genetically.
And probably because I feel like Mike Flanagan is someone who doesn't really look down on horror creatures, but kind of uses them to express emotional turmoil when it comes to the main characters, while Guillermo del Toro literally uses the creatures as main characters who are going through certain emotional turmoil and showing how society just keeps seeing them as monsters instead of seeing them as just other creatures who just don't look like you. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video and my breakdown of all the different episodes. Let me know down in the comments which one was your favorite episode, and if you would like, for example, to have a second season, I would really love it, especially because there are so many talented horror directors out there and I love that they get to express themselves in these ways. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Every single like that you drop will go to Guillermo del Toro because he deserves all the love in the world. He seems like such a nice man, and plus in a couple of weeks we'll have his new version of Pinocchio in stop motion, which will come out on Netflix once again, and I'm really looking forward to it. Don't forget to stay spooky for the Halloween celebrations. I'm Patrick, and this is Torn Apart.
The best horror for me is the one where you come in feeling you're gonna be afraid and you end up crying.
Yeah.
And you end up being moving and recognizing yourself in it.